Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Dr. Myers.
Oh gosh, sounds like you have what I had.
Yep.
Oh gosh, rest your voice. That's what I kept being told, and it did help. So let me take a sec to check everybody who's on Zoom in. Oh, Stacy, I appreciate it. You know, it's November 1st, so we got to have Mariah Carey. Great. That's everybody. Cool. She's being defrosted as we speak. I love it. Okay, so what I was saying before I opened the Zoom is that today we will, yeah, Jade, I should have sent an email. Last week I was like, we'll probably be in person on Monday, and then I didn't send one until like 2 minutes ago. So no worries. If anyone's on campus and wants to wander this way, feel free. If you want to just stay in your dorm room, also feel free. It's all good. So today we are going to finish up our lecture about how to lie with stats. And then we'll get into the lecture, maybe. We'll see how long it takes, but we might get into the lecture about how to lie with charts as well. Yeah, I'm almost back to full strength. There will be times where I still sound like I'm going through puberty. So apologies in advance for that. Okay. So we're continuing to roll through the readings for the How to Lie with Stats. And so the next one, the third one in your assignment was the data analysis is theorizing. Data analysis is thinking. Don't want you, Google Drive. All right. So when you all think of data analysis, what do you think of? What do you think it entails? And people in the chat, feel free to type as well or unmute yourself. So when you all just think of the word data analysis, what thoughts or feelings come to mind? What's that? Processing, yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people think it's sort of magic, sort of voodoo. And in fact, the nice thing is that we've had a series of not only mathematicians, but also just psychologists and other social scientists who really make a concerted effort to develop statistics that are fairly easy to use and can answer complex questions. So programs like SPSS, there's a program I've yet to learn, but that a lot of people use now called R, where it's basically like you can do anything, you just have to write the program for it, but people tend to share their programming. And then there are other things for more specific types of analyses. So for example, for my dissertation, I used one called HLM, or Hierarchical Linear Modeling. And it was specifically designed to look at nested data. So for example, I had a bunch of time points for each person, and then also I wanted to compare across people. And so that program is designed to do that. So there is a little bit of a learning curve to learn those programs, but once you know them, it's pretty straightforward. Why do you need to think carefully about data analysis? Why can't you just sort of throw some stuff together and see what happens?
That's not really science.
Right. I think a lot of people, and researchers are guilty of this too. A lot of people kind of forget that once we get data. It's fun when you get your data. You get to be like, ooh, what's different? What's going on here? Right. And so I believe it was this article talked about how like pre-registration is actually really good for this because like you're set in stone what analyses you're going to run. And so you don't do what's called like data fishing, or we're going to talk in a minute about P hacking. So, and that's just the letter P. It's not like urination. So that's a different thing. And there can be creativity in data analysis in terms of how you look at who has, what variables you control for, what type of analysis you're looking at, that type of thing. Yeah, and that's Oliver has a really good point in the chat that it can be really easy to misunderstand too, right? Data analysis in and of itself is theorizing. When you run an analysis, you are hypothesizing, even theorizing, these variables are related in this way, right? So again, it's not just like stabbing in the dark. It actually is, I am saying that this variable predicts that variable, or that this independent variable should lead to a change in that. So in some ways, like, you should, in theory, be planning what analyses you should run as you come up with your hypotheses, basically. And that's actually a nice way to like ground yourself with hypotheses too, is to say, okay, so this is a great idea I have about how things are related, but how am I actually going to test that, right? And so that can be really helpful to be like, okay, well, I need to make sure I'm measuring the right variables right, and then I'll have these analyses I can run. Any decisions we make about how we're going to analyze the data imply something about the variables as they exist in the real world, that they're related to each other, that one precedes the other, things along those lines. All right, so p-hacking. I have a nice little video John Oliver did about this, and it's like a rip of a rip, so it's not the best quality. But I just like that, like a popular TV show was actually looking into this. And John Oliver's just always amusing, so it's kind of fun to watch. So short, 3 minutes.
Science. The thing we love and respect so much, we only allow scientists to be portrayed by the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Nicolas Cage, and Al Pacino. That is how much we respect them and the complexity of the work they do. Science is constantly producing new studies, as you would know if you've ever watched TV.
A new study shows how sugar might fuel the growth of cancer.
A new study shows late-night snacking could damage the part of your brain that creates and stores memories.
A new study finds pizza is the most addictive food in America.
A new study suggests hugging your dog is bad for your dog.
A new study showing that drinking a glass of red wine is just as good as spending an hour at the gym.
What? That last one? No! That last one doesn't even sound like science. It's more like something your sassy aunt would wear on a T-shirt. Time.com once even ran the headline, "Scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer." It turns out the study never mentioned either of those things. It just pointed out that certain sulfide compounds are useful pharmacological tools to study mitochondrial dysfunction. And while that Time story was later heavily corrected, the scientists told us that we still get phone calls and emails from strange radio and TV shows wanting us to talk about farts, which is clearly a waste of their time. There are now so many studies being thrown around, they can seem to contradict one another. In just the last few months, we've seen studies about coffee that claim it may reverse the effects of liver damage, help prevent colon cancer, decrease the risk of endometrial cancer, and increase the risk of miscarriage. Scientists are under constant pressure to publish, with tenure and funding on the line. And to get published, it helps to have results that seem new and striking, because scientists know nobody is publishing a study that says nothing up with acai berries. And to get those results, there are all sorts of ways that, consciously or not, you can tweak your study. You could alter how long it lasts, or make your random sample too small to be reliable, or engage in something that scientists call p-hacking. It's very complicated, but it basically means collecting lots of variables and then playing with your data until you find something that counts as statistically significant, but is probably meaningless. For example, the website 538 surveyed 54 people and collected over 1,000 variables, and through p-hacking the results, was able to find statistically significant correlations between eating cabbage and having an innie belly button, drinking iced tea and believing Crash didn't deserve to win Best Picture, and eating raw tomatoes and Judaism. And if you think I'm exaggerating about the impact that this misreporting can have on our faith in science, look at an example from some of the people most guilty of it. Because the Today Show, which lives for scientific studies, recently concluded one segment like this.
Like a lot of studies that we love around here, there have been a couple, especially related to women, about the benefits, as I get all serious, on whole milk. Hey, whole milk, but it's true.
Well, there's a lot of research, though, that says actually having whole milk or having whole fat dairy products actually can help you lose weight.
I think the way to live your life is you find the study that sounds best to you, and you go with that.
No! No, 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 no!
All right, so that gives you a little bit of a flair for what p-hacking is. And also you could see the file drawer problem there, right, too. The whole idea, like, no one's gonna publish, sorry, a study that says something like, SAE barriers don't really do anything, right? It's not catchy. It's actually, so I got married in 2009. And that's when like the SAE diet was really in. And so this was before I put ad blockers on my web browsers. And all my social media ads were for like diets, and SAE berry diet, la la la. And then I changed my status to married. And then all of a sudden it was about baby stuff. And that was the day I had sold an ad blocker. I was like, nope, you don't get to tell me when my timing should go for having a family. Okay. So as it mentioned, and as I mentioned a minute ago, pre-registration can help with this. Again, saying this is what we're going to do in the study. And there are times where it's perfectly acceptable to do what we call post hoc analyses. So let's say you do a claim analysis and something significant comes out that you didn't quite expect. It's okay to then like take and analyze the components of that to figure out why. And in fact, that's sort of considered a normal part of doing analyses like complicated ANOVAs, for example. Alrighty. So this sort of follows that really well, the many analyst one data set. So if you didn't get a chance to read this one, the goals of this study were to see basically what happens if we give a whole bunch of people the exact same data set with the exact same question. How are they going to analyze it? So they gave it to 61 data analysts, and the research question for this particular data set was, are soccer refs more likely to give red cards to darker skinned rather than light skinned players? And so what did they find? It was complicated. So pretty much everybody analyzed the data differently. Now, this doesn't mean that there were 61 different analyses they could run. What it means is that different people included different control vectors, right? Different variables that they were considering, like that third variable that they wanted to account for. And by doing that, and we call those covariants, that can affect the significance of your overall finding. So 21 analysts used 21 combinations of these covariants. So 69% of the teams found a statistically significant positive effect. And then 9 teams didn't find any significant relationship because they'd thrown so many of these covariants in basically that it all kind of washed out. Now, who's right? I mean, part of it is it depends on how you're asking the question, right? So this seems like a fairly simple hypothesis, right? But you kind of need to include more in it. Our soccer refs more likely to give red cards to darker skinned rather than light skinned players if the ref is also dark skinned versus light skinned, if we're looking at certain ages, if we're looking at the demographic makeup of the city we're at. So you need to consider those things, especially if you're already collecting that data, right, when you create these hypotheses. What I really liked is that after they got all the analyses in, they sent them back out to the same 61 people. And they said, hey, look at everybody else's and, see what they did and see what you think. And so they then debated and discussed which covariants should have been included. And it just created a really nice open dialogue that all the analysts really said, like, helped them in their thinking. And so it really speaks to the idea that this would be a great scientific practice in general, right? To have someone like peer review your analyses. Now, does this happen? Usually not, unfortunately. But there are times where you might bring on a stats expert, for example. So like on my dissertation, I used that fancy HLM software, and I wanted to look at a covariant in it as a potential variable that actually affected the relationship, called a moderator. And then I also wanted to look at sort of like a chain of things. And we were like, can this program even do this? So we went to another professor in the department. He didn't do anything with eating disorders. He actually studied depression, but he knew the stats. And so he helped us figure out how to run those statistics. And he ended up a co-author on our paper, so good for him, right? It helps him towards tenure. But sometimes you have to do that. You have to go to people and say, hey, can you help look this over? We're not an expert in this area, but you can help. So what are the consequences of these different analytic approaches? Let me do this. There we go. So we saw a lot of different, as I mentioned, variability here in terms of people saying, okay, so the positive relationship is likely caused by referee bias or caused by unobserved variables of the player's behavior. They don't know the cause. There's other outlier things, contingent on other variables in the data, like differences across leagues. And then again, some had found like no relationship. And so then what they did is they basically had them kind of rate how much do you agree with the way people did this? And people tend to, like most, the idea that like we probably aren't accounting for everything. Like there's probably another explanation, which sounds frustrating, but that's actually sort of typically what we find in science. So even like there's a way when you do regression, which is like a fancy correlation, you can see basically how much of the variability in the variable you're trying to predict is accounted for by the other variables you're considering. And I think for my analyses, the highest I've ever gotten is in the like 60% range. So that still means there would be like 40% unaccounted, right? And that's considered pretty good. If you have one in the like 20s or 30s, that's still publishable. So there's just, as we've talked about before, people are really complex. Social situations are really complex. So there are a lot of things that we should take into account, and sometimes we just don't think of all of them, right? Sometimes we're not even measuring all of them because we didn't think, oh yeah, that would be something. And then they kind of showed all the different analyses people ran. So these are just different ways to analyze the same data. I'm looking, it looks like pretty much everybody's doing a regression-based analysis, so that's good. No one was like going off the rails and doing a t-test. Right, and so, and like with certain types of analyses, you've got a stronger effect size, basically. So again, just a really interesting way to think about like, what would happen if you took the same data and handed it to somebody else, right? Alrighty, so that is the end of that one. Now we're going to look at how to lie with tables and charts. So I had some fun making this PowerPoint yesterday, Google Slides, whatever you want to call it. Let me hang on, I have a toggle here. There we go. So I scoured the web, and there are actually a decent number of websites that are dedicated to just showing off really bad charts and tables. So I found some of those, and that's how we're going to start today, is looking at some of those sort of ridiculous things. So we looked at this one previously, but I thought I'd bring it back just because it's such a good, bad example, right? But it's like, I haven't added it up, but this clearly adds up to more than 100%, right? It might even be more than 200%. And yet they're representing it as if it's like percentages of this person, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. It's misleading. This has to be my favorite. I think almost every website I looked at had this on there. It's just a triumph of bad graph or chart creation. So this is a pie chart. Again, pie charts should be 100%, right? So this was a primary. What year were around me? I don't even remember. There we go, 2012. It's right up at the top. So 2012 primary. And so you've got they've asked people, who would you vote for, or would you vote for this person, probably, right? Yes, no. And so because of that, because they're probably, it's Fox News, they're probably surveying people who are generally conservative, right? Over 50% of them in every case said, I would back this person, sure. Like, I'm going to vote Republican no matter who it is, essentially. And so, yeah, 70%, 63%, 60%, it's just like, that doesn't make any sense, guys, right? Unfortunately, a lot of cable news shows, people I think like to pick on Fox News, understandably, but like CNN and MSNBC also had some really egregious examples here. It's like whoever they've got making their data visualizations has no idea what they're doing, right? Like they should just hire one of you and you'd do a better job, right? So yeah, these can be not only misleading, but confusing, right? And people can be like, what? You know, when you're looking at it. This is a type of chart that I've never actually even seen until I went down this rabbit hole. So this is like a bar graph and pie chart kind of combined, and it just doesn't make any sense. It's like divided into quadrants for no good reason. And it's supposed to be like what federal subsidies are going to, but like they kind of show relatively how much, right? But not really. It's like that's like 2.3 billion, but just sort of floating there, right? So like, I didn't know that these things existed. I'm really glad I didn't know, because this is confusing as I'll get it, right? Like, it's really hard to glean meaningful information from this. And that was a lot of what I stumbled upon as I sort of had fun on these websites, is that a lot of these aren't intentionally misleading. It's just like someone was like, this looks great, this is really eye-catching. And it just leaves people confused when they look at it, right? And that's almost as problematic, because the whole point of doing a chart or a graph, of visualizing your data, is to make it more approachable for people and better easily understood, right? So definitely a pitfall. This was another one. This was on several websites. So this is salary data for players in the Major League Soccer league. That's what it says, but in Major League Soccer, I guess I should say. So you have the teams, and then like these are individual players' salaries, but then like you get to like the newbies, right, who aren't making very much, and it's just like, this doesn't tell you much, right? Other than like LA has a much bigger budget than everybody else, right? And again, it's confusing. This would have probably been much better illustrated by just a table, right, that listed everybody's salary. And so, and like, I think the colors are supposed to be, yeah, like their positions, but like, why, right? Like, kind of doesn't matter. Yeah, very confusing, unnecessarily. And then this was another great example. People love to try to use catchy visualizations, turn things into objects that people recognize, right? I really like this. Fresh vegetables / melons, and they use an onion. I mean, like, an onion's a vegetable, but it's not a melon, and that's the word that's right next to it, right? And like this lamb, that's way more than 52% of that leg of lamb, right? Basically, again, these websites that we're looking at are like, don't try to be cute. It's unnecessary. It's not going to be helpful, right? And in fact, it will just sort of confuse people. And again, yes, it's eye-catching, but like, and like, you know, without any sort of legend or explanation down here, right? We just have some flags with percentages. And I think it's like the percentage of those foods that's imported from that particular country, but it's really unclear, right? I'm having to guess that. So, yeah, and this like seafood, 88%, it doesn't actually like even it points to the gap in between the two sections, right? Like I would assume they're trying to say the bottom section's 88%, but it's not real clear. So yeah, unnecessary. This is another one where again, I think they were just trying to be cute and, you know, put percentage data over a picture of the US. But like, because they put it over a picture of the US, it looks like all the Asian American people live in Maine, right? Like, which probably not true, right? Well, we know that's not true. And I don't even know that there is a large Asian American population in Maine at all, right? And all the people who are other basically almost live in Canada, right? Like, no. And in fact, you know, they've got, just because of the way they visualize this, they've got the South as white, and we know that the South is probably the most diverse area besides the cities in the North. So yeah, and they're trying to show change over time as well. Yeah, so they're trying to show like, okay, in 1960, this was the breakdown, and now in 2010 it was this, and this is what's projected to be by 2060. But like, yeah, also confusing. All you had to do, right, was have an X and a Y axis, not put it on a cutesy little figure of the US, and it'd be much more understandable. Also, yeah, Alaska and Hawaii being represented as all white, very problematic because they have huge native populations. Here's another fun one. What are your plans after high school? So like the breakdown, probably accurate, right? But the bars, not proportionally accurate at all, right? Like, I don't know if they just like found a figure that existed with these bars or what, right? But like the 1% should be like, right? So yeah, I can't. I don't even know. And then this is something similar. Again, this is like a local news station. And it was like they didn't understand which bar was which somehow, I think. And like, yeah, I don't even know. It's very confusing. Like, I guess those should be swapped, the bar sizes. It's just the post for this was just, my local news doesn't understand how to make a bar graph. And here's another one where they had people vote on their favorite season, apparently on Twitter. And again, like, okay, 53% is more, but why are the 217s different? Right? Like, what? Yeah, I don't know. I can't. And then this one is another one that is, again, just like confusing, because what I'm trying to say, I think, is that Girl Scouts had fewer sales because everything was digital during the pandemic. But like, then they're looking more at like which cookies are selling better. And again, the bars are off proportionally, right? Like for whatever reason. Oh, because they just taped these out. That's why. I couldn't figure that out when I was looking at it yesterday. But yeah, they just used the bars to put the name of the cookies on it. And that's what the bars are proportional to, not the actual value. And again, this is CNN, you would think. They're pretty well-funded company. They would have someone who could make nice data visualization. Apparently not, right? And then they're also showing the top selling ones by region. So I thought that was sort of interesting in general, but again, not related to their question, right? Their question is, are sales down? And instead, what the visualization is saying is like, which are the most popular cookies, right? So like, that doesn't necessarily make sense. I thought it was really interesting though, that like, samosas are the most popular only in Florida. Well, that's fine. And then this is another one where a couple different problems here. One is, I think they tried to visually represent how far apart these times were from each other, but they didn't necessarily do the best job doing that. And then the other problem is like, this shouldn't be a straight line, right? If you look at those numbers, they're not equidistant apart going up. So again, why? We're just being confusing. You know, they're probably trying to say something in particular with this. It's just increasing and increasing. Like, yes, it's increasing, but not this way. And you could get the same message across if you made this chart accurate, right? It's not. Yeah, like if they really want to do it by quarter, they'd do all the quarters of each year. So I think they just cherry picked the quarters where there was the most job loss. Yeah, it doesn't, you're right. I did miss that too. So I was like, oh, it's a year at a weird time. But yep. Yeah, that makes no sense. And then this is just a case of like someone putting in the wrong place. Partially, but then also read the question and then look at the answers. What's the best part? Is this paper bowl? Yes or no, but also flipped. So Winnipeg paper. But yeah, again, not to pick on this local paper because we're seeing the big corporations do this too, right? But yes, what's the best part of the Super Bowl? No. I'm guessing since it's Canada, it was actually, did you watch the Super Bowl, right? And 73% of people are like, why do I care? Right, we don't really have teams. The other one that I love. So this is showing the heights of bridges that like semis could go under, right? And it's showing the differences between the maximum height that's allowed, right? And so they're starting at like, I think 13 feet 6 inches, which is the baseline for semi-trailer height. And then this is what they want. And then they just say average house cat showed first scale. But like, if you're looking at these, so you're not looking at the fact that, you know, these are, you know, maybe 6 inches or so, right? You're like, whoa, that's a big house cat, right? Like a 14-foot house cat. I don't even think that like, if a lion had a, no, it wouldn't be 14 feet tall. It would probably be like way high, right? So yeah, again, just bad data. Someone thought this would be helpful. This actually reminds me of another, I think it's on Instagram that I follow. It's, no, it's a Facebook group, and it's like Americans will use anything to get out of using the metric system. And it's like banana for scale, things like that. So this is very much this belongs on that page. Yeah, and here's another one. Again, trying to visualize data in a way that they thought was helpful. But if you wanted to do this, you would have to start the y-axis at 0, right? Because now it just looks like people in India are just teeny. In fact, they're only 5 inches shorter than the average person from Latvia, right? They're just like giants. Jack and the Beanstalk here. I also like, there's just me stepping back of like, why are we comparing these particular countries? Like, I guess maybe they tried to get like one per continent or something like that. It's just, it's weird all around. But yeah, that poor person from India. But not really. And then here is, this was about the Terry Shivo case. So if you're not familiar with this case, I think it was the early 2000s. And Terry Shivo was a woman who was, well, to back it up even more, she had an aneurysm, I think. And what a lot of people didn't know about her is that she was actually bulimic. And she had an aneurysm while she was purging, while she was vomiting. So people were like, eating disorders aren't that dangerous. Can be, right? And she was brain dead, but like her body was still functioning. And so they wanted to take her off life support, but because her lungs were still functioning, like what they actually had to do was take her off a feeding tube, basically, and then kind of let her starve because she was in Florida and they don't have Death with Dignity Act. And so this was a big deal. Like President Bush got involved. And I think eventually they went through the court and the court said, yeah, you know, like, I think she had a living will and it said she didn't want to be kept alive with these methods. And so I think that's why the court was like, we have to abide by the police document. And so this makes it look like, I think the like caption on this on the 20-minute charts webpage was like, those darn liberals, right? Like, it makes it look like so many more Democrats, right? We're like, yeah, kill the lady. But in fact, again, it's starting at 50%. So more than half of Republicans and independents were also like, we should let this person pass in peace, right? Right, exactly. Exactly. So again, that's where starting that axis at 0, like we talked about before, could be pretty important. And then I thought it was pretty interesting. There's a couple websites now and like news articles dedicated entirely to like visualization of COVID data and how that's helpful or not in people understanding the pandemic. And this, as you can imagine, is an example of not, because it's just overwhelming, right? Like there's nothing inaccurate about this. It's just, there's a lot of info, there's a lot of sort of confusing things. There's like, these are new cases, the red bars, and then the blue bars are how many people are getting out of the hospital, which is like positive, right, that that's happening. But because they're kind of jammed together like this, right? And this is by day, like this is really like minuscule, really focusing in, right? It's really confusing, and like just glancing at it without looking at the key, I would assume it's like new cases and deaths, right? Because that's what's usually reported. And so this particular article suggested doing this instead. They actually proposed a solution, which I really like. Just make them 2 different charts, right? Makes it easier. And then you can sort of visualize it with a line and versus the trend, right? And then see, you know, cases are on the rise in terms of new cases, and we're kind of maybe plateauing in terms of people who are getting discharged because they're healthy enough, you know, not to need hospital care. Alrighty. So then I have a little video that looks more at some of these types of examples. So.
This is Stephanie from statisticshowto.com, and in this video I'll be showing you different types of misleading graphs. The first type of problem I'll be showing you is to do with a vertical scale. That's this scale over here, and if you take a close look, although it looks like if Bush tax cuts expire it's going to be disastrous, the facts are the scale starts at 34%, so there's only going to be a slight jump in the top tax rate, not this ballooning tax rate jump that Fox News wanted you to believe. The second type of misleading graph is where data is incorrectly plotted, and not to keep bashing Fox News, but this graph did appear on Fox News, and it was the unemployment rate and how it's risen and stayed pretty stagnant under President Obama. But if you look at this last point here, 8.6% is plotted incorrectly. If it had been plotted correctly, it would actually have shown a drop in the unemployment rate. Another problem with graphs is incomplete data. This particular graph from the CBPP analysis shows the economic downturn and legacy of Bush policies. These drive record deficits. Well, the years we're looking at from 2009 until 2019, there's no data from prior to 2009 being shown. If it had have been shown, it would have demonstrated that in 2007 the budget was just 1.2% of GDP, and that was when the housing market collapsed. So if you're going to show an economic downturn and say something like a record deficit, you really want to go back in time as far as you possibly can before you start saying record deficits. This type of graph is just completely missing an axis. There is no vertical axis here. There's nothing labeled. We have no idea what this is supposed to represent. Lanacane is apparently better than hydrocortisone at relieving itch after a minute, I think, but I'm not sure. But this was an actual ad for Lanacane, and it's just a dreadful graph. Here's an example of a graph where it's all read just completely wrong. This image was from the Mail on Sunday, a British newspaper, and the tabloid used it to claim that global warming had stopped. Unfortunately, the guy who wrote the article, his name was David Rose, he didn't understand what the graph was telling him. He made a couple of errors. First of all, the graph is showing air temperatures, and it's a very poor measure of global warming, as much of the air temperature heat ends up in the oceans. So he interpreted the graph to mean that global warming had stopped, when in fact you can't deduce that from the graph at all. And we're back to Fox News for this one. This is an example of a graph where the numbers just don't add up. A pie chart should add up to 100%. Well, if you add the figures in this chart, it's not quite 100%. I don't know what the Fox News statisticians were doing in this one, but the numbers just didn't add up. This graph, I'm not even sure I could read it. If you look at the graph, it looks like the statement is true that job and health insurance losses are accelerating, they're going up. But if you look over here, uninsured Americans, and then you look over here, unemployment rate, there's two y-axes, and it looks like if we're over here, we go in the millions of people, and this might be a percentage, but I'm already confused. So when you're making a graph, you should only put one y-axis unless you want people to be confused, or unless you want to deceive them. And finally, the winner in the misleading graphs category is, drumroll please to Fox News for this gem. Looks like there's more people on welfare than there are who have full-time jobs. As Media Matters points out, Fox's figure for the number of people on welfare comes from a Census Bureau account of participation in means-tested programs. Anybody that lived in a household with somebody, i.e. your mum, your dad, your brother Joe, your cousin Sam, if anybody was receiving any kind of welfare benefits, then every individual in that house was counted. On the other hand, people with a full-time job, the figure Fox used included only individuals who worked, not individuals residing in a household where at least one person worked. Check out Statistics How To for more articles and videos on everything.
That one basically double counted people, essentially. So these are everywhere, and again, like, she and I are both picking a little on Fox News because they're pretty egregious, but you saw CNN, local news, like everybody kind of does this, right?
This is Stephanie.
Alrighty, so axes. Again, this is something we keep getting hammered home, but bar chart axes should include 0, right? And this is a really nice example from your reading of what it looks like if you do that versus you don't. So let me minimize our chat here. So here's the same chart where the axis starts at 0, and you can see the differences look pretty tiny, right? As opposed to if you started at 36 and it only goes to 42, it really makes those differences look much bigger than they are. really interesting thing that they argued was that line graph actually don't need to include a zero. So the bar graphs are saying, like, essentially the absolute magnitude of values associated with each category. So those should be proportional, right? So this is showing the number of weekly hours of work in their main job of full-time employees in various places in Europe, right? And so these bars, whichever of the two graphs you're looking at, show the number of hours, right? And so you do need an idea of how accurate that is. A line graph, though, they argued, is looking at the change in the dependent variable as the independent variable changes. All right, so it doesn't need to focus on that absolute magnitude. So basically, they say line graphs should not include a zero if we want to look at things like there are these small differences are really actually having an impact. If we think about that clinical significance, right, that we talked about last week. Okay, so if you look at the average global temperatures overall in Fahrenheit, it looks like they're not changing that much. But if you zoom in, you can see there is an overall upward trend. And again, like, it's a degree or two. Why does that matter? Well, we know from climate science that that degree or two matters a lot, right? It means more glacial and ice cap melting, which raises the sea levels, which causes flooding in places like here, right? And all those things kind of add up to the impacts of it. What you just saw from her is saying, yeah, that you shouldn't put multiple axes on a single graph. It just gets confusing, right? And this one, I believe, also actually has three. Yeah, there's one here and there's two here. It makes it much harder to interpret. Sorry, guys. And it just sort of like, what? And this, if I recall, was sort of like a questionable graph anyway, trying to say that like thyroid cancer was linked to corn and soy consumption. Again, there's probably a whole bunch of other things going on, right? That those missing third variables. Right, let's stop there for today, and we'll pick back up there on Wednesday, and then we'll start to get into our next lecture. So we're sort of almost caught up, which is good. We're keeping us on track. And yeah, thank you all, both the folks online and the folks in person, and have a great day, and I'll see you on Wednesday.